Thank you all so much for joining us for our lunchtime Buying Solar 101 webinar. The purpose of this webinar is to give you consumers, homeowners, property owners, the tools and resources you need to effectively purchase for solar and advocate for yourself. If we haven't met yet, my name is Adrian Keller. I'm the program director for Solar United Neighbors based here in Phoenix. I'm really thrilled to be joined by Autumn Johnson with the Arizona Solar Energy Industries Association, as well as Kate Bowman, who joins us from Boat Solar. Thank you both so much for co-hosting this webinar with us and for all the prep work you did to get to this point. Some really quick housekeeping before we dive in. We are in a webinar mode, so we can't see or hear you, but we want to get to your questions. So if you have a question, use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, type those in there, and we'll get to as many as we can. The chat function is also enabled. Probably best to use that for just really quick short comments or if you're chatting with other attendees. But if you want us to answer a question, use that Q&A feature. And then if you need closed captions, you can enable those by clicking More at the bottom of your screen, then click Captions, then Show Captions, and select your preferred language. I'll just leave the screen up for one more moment in case anybody needs to read those instructions.
Adrian, can you double check that the right screen is shared? We do not see the slideshow. I kind of see your like not full screen.
Thanks for flagging that. All right, is that better?
That looks great. Thank you.
All right, sorry about that, everybody. So before we start, kind of just level setting of thinking about some of the reasons why people in Arizona want to go solar. I think it's fair to say one of the most common reasons people talk to me about wanting to go solar is to save money. By installing solar, you're able to generate some of your own electricity, which helps you reduce the amount you need to purchase from a utility, which saves you money monthly on your electric bills. I also hear from a lot of people who want to go solar for reasons you could call energy independence, or just the ability to produce your own energy at home instead of only relying on a monopoly utility for all of your power. Solar, especially when paired with battery storage, increases resilience and can insulate you from power outages and grid disturbances. And distributed solar in particular, meaning solar installed close to where it's needed, is especially helpful at improving the resilience and stability of our grid overall. Rather than just relying on a couple very large power plants hundreds of miles away, the more we can produce power close to where it's needed, the more efficient and protected our grid will be. I also hear from people who are really worried about future utility rate increases. We've definitely experienced our fair share of those recently, and we don't expect those to slow down. By adding solar, it can help you avoid some of the ups and downs of the energy market by providing a more consistent, predictable, and affordable supply of electricity, which can help you hedge against inflation and future utility price increases. Water savings is another reason. Coal, gas, nuclear all require lots of water to function, whereas solar requires next to none, which is very helpful for us in the West. And finally, we're the sunniest state in the nation. Florida may be called the Sunshine State, but we get more days of sunshine per year than them. This is one of our most abundant and important natural resources, and we should be taking advantage of that. So if you're new to all this, you may be asking yourself, how do solar panels work? How does all this system work together? So when we're saying solar today, we're really referring mostly to PV cells or photovoltaics, and that's the technology that converts sunlight into electricity. Solar panels are made up of several different semiconductor materials, and when photons from sunlight hit the solar panel, it dislodges those electrons, which generates a flow of electricity. Now you'll need an inverter to go along with your solar panels that inverts that power from DC direct current to AC alternating current so that your home, the appliances in your home can actually use that energy. And then the electric service panel, I kind of think of as the brains of the whole operation, so it directs power where it's needed, when it's needed. And solar owners will have what's called a bidirectional utility meter or electric meter. This is important so that the utility can not only read and measure how much energy you're purchasing and consuming from them, they also need to know how much excess solar production is being fed back out the opposite way and being fed back onto your account for credit. So when you're at home and you're using electricity at home, the sun is shining, the power that your solar panels generate is first going to be directed to your home. But if you're producing more electricity than you need, that excess will flow back out onto the grid for credit on your bill. And the cool thing about that is it's going to be consumed by your immediate neighbors and the buildings surrounding you. So whenever you're producing excess solar power, there's a good chance you're providing power to some of your close neighbors. So some of the things to consider when deciding about solar. First, we live in Arizona, which means we don't have community solar. So unfortunately, there's very few ways for renters to benefit from solar. So if you want to be able to install solar, you need to be a property owner in the state. It's important to make sure that there's not a significant amount of trees or buildings or structures that are shading a large portion of your roof. If there are, it's not uncommon for people to trim some of those trees, but if you're in a very heavily forested area or something, that may be something to consider. And then the size, shape, and slope of your roof is also important to keep in mind. Ideally, you'll want the solar panels to be at between a 15 and 40-degree angle slope. Don't worry if your roof isn't that exact slope, your installer has devices they can use to get it up at the optimal angle. And then south facing, putting solar on the south side of your roof is always going to be the best. That's where you're absorbing the most amount of sunlight and can generate the most amount of electricity. But solar on the east side or west side of your roof can definitely work well. We just don't recommend putting it on the north side. And then you want to be thinking about the age and quality of your roof. We definitely recommend for you to have at least 10 to 15 years of life left in your roof before installing solar. And it can be a really good idea to get a roof inspection done from a company separate than your installer, just to make sure your roof is in good shape. If your roof is not in good shape, it can be really expensive to have to remove those panels, do roofing work, and then reinstall them, especially if it's only a year or two after installation. So that's why we generally recommend about 10 or 15 years left in your roof. If you're not sure if your roof is a good site, you're not sure about the suitability, you can reach out to our organization, Solar United Neighbors. We'll do a free roof review for you and check the size, shape, and slope and shading, all the things to make sure you're a good candidate. Now, the good news is nowadays, most types of roofs can handle solar installation. The industry is always evolving and they have a lot of cool technologies they can use to work with most types of roofs. For sloped roofs, like asphalt shingle or tile that we see a lot of here in Arizona, typically there'll be rails that are screwed onto your roof, and then the solar panels are sort of clipped onto those beams. If you have a flat roof, solar can work well. Sometimes the installer may weigh the panels down, or they may use what's called a pitch pocket system just to angle them upright at the optimal angle so they can generate the most amount of electricity. And if for whatever reason your roof is not a good candidate for solar, and you have a decent amount of land, ground-mounted solar is certainly something to consider, but is generally more expensive. And so we encourage people to pursue rooftop solar if they can. Big part of what our organization, Solar United Neighbors, does is organizing solar co-ops, which are basically big group purchasing campaigns. Imagine you and 100 or so of your neighbors all knock on the door of a solar installation company and say, hey, we all want to get solar. What kind of deal can you give us? That's essentially what we're organizing here with a solar co-op. We group together large amounts of consumers in a similar geographic area. We educate them all about solar, review their roof, and then we, Sun, request bids from solar installers on behalf of the group. Because the group is so large, installers are offering bulk discounts and pricing discounts in order to win the group's business. And then as a non-biased 501c3, Sun is there to help back you up throughout the entire process, providing free education, technical advice, and support. And this can be a really helpful and easy way to go solar since we take a lot of the bidding process out of it, in addition to saving you money. Our co-ops are only open to specific geographic areas. So right now, if you live in Flagstaff, Sedona, or surrounding areas in Coconino County, you can join our Northern Arizona Solar Co-op until January. Otherwise, if you live in another part of the state and you're interested, we have a wait list you can join to be notified when one opens up. But if you're not going through a solar co-op, which is going to be most people, and you're working through yourself, here are kind of the steps to start the very process for you. So who you decide to work with, which installer, which vendor is going to be really important. There are a lot of solar installers in Arizona. It's a very competitive market. Some of these installers are fantastic. Some of them, unfortunately, are less than fantastic. So always do your research before signing a contract, and don't get sucked into a high pressure sales situation that you don't feel comfortable with. It's okay and recommended to take your time, sleep on it, get multiple bids, and compare your options. We always encourage people to get at least 3 bids so they can compare their options and make sure they're getting the best deal for them. Some of the ways to find reputable solar installers Can't hurt to always ask a friend or a neighbor who you know has gone solar. What was their experience like? Who did they work with? And what was that like for them? But we really also recommend checking out the Arizona Solar Energy Industry. ARISEA has a list of member companies. Part of ARISEA's mission is to enhance consumer protections in the residential rooftop solar industry. And as such, their member companies sign a code of ethics and are held to a higher standard of operating. And so we definitely recommend at least one, if not all three of the bids you get are from an ARISEA member company. Most utilities, including APS, also have a list of preferred solar installers. Similarly, these companies will go through a vetting process to be able to be on that list and are held to a higher standard. Once you're ready to start talking to installers, keep the following handy. Copies of your electric bill. Installers are going to want to know how much usage you're traditionally using so they can accurately design a size for your home. Keep in mind, are you interested in battery storage or do you just want the solar panels? If you are, what's the installer telling you? What are they offering for storage and what are those prices? It's also good to know if beforehand if you will be financing or paying cash. Installers offer a lot of different financing options, and so it's good to know that going into it. And some other things to keep in mind when deciding on an installer, it's a good idea to ask, how many installations have they done in my local area? Are they familiar with my local city or county's permitting process and the interconnection process with my utility? If they've never worked in your area before, that might be a little bit of a bumpier road. Check out Better Business Bureau. They have a lot of reviews for solar companies, and check out the company you're considering. Are there any open complaints against them? Have they been resolved? What are other customers saying? And another thing to keep in mind of what your installers are offering you is warranties. Typically, there's going to be multiple different kinds of warranties that will come with the solar installation for parts, equipment, and roof penetrations. How long are those warranties? How do they work? And are they transferable? That's really helpful information to know from a solar installer. And then finally, it's a good idea to make sure that the installer you're working with is registered with the Registrar of Contractors, and similarly check to make sure there aren't open complaints against them. And then a lot of people really like to work with installers who are certified by NABCEP. That's the North American Board of Certified Electrical Professionals. They offer a solar certification that is really good. And then if this is all overwhelming for you and you're not sure where to start and you need help, we've got some great free resources to aid you. ARISEA has a solar customers webpage where you can find those member companies. The National SEIA has a great consumer guide to solar power. And then our organization, Solar United Neighbors, also has a free Go Solar guide. Additionally, if you've received multiple bids and you need any help comparing them, you can send them to our organization and we'll review them and answer any questions for free. So once you've found an installer you like, you've got financing lined up, and you actually sign a contract to get solar installed, it's going to take a couple weeks, if not a few more, for the permitting process, depending on how fast it takes for your city or county. Once they have permitting and design approved, the day of installation is very quick. It usually takes less than a day, maybe 2 days at most. And then once your system is installed, it can take a couple more weeks for the utility to sign off on it, essentially say everything is up to the larger electricity system. So from the time you sign a contract to the time when your solar panels are turned on and actually working, you could be looking at a couple months depending on how long that permitting process takes. Now, the good news is once you've had your system installed, it will last a very long time, provide clean energy, lower your costs, and protect against future utility rate increases. It's just really important that you take your time and choose a reputable solar installer. The other good news is that maintenance is really easy and pretty low for solar panels. Normal rain or precipitation will help keep them clean. Visual inspections are really good to have done every couple of years just to make sure the solar installation is working. And then finally, most solar installations now come with an app where you can track the production in real time on your phone or tablet. That's really smart to do to make sure that there's not any sudden drops in production. With that, I think I'll pass it over to Kate.
Thanks, Adrian. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the power generation from solar panels. And one of your top reasons for installing solar, if not your top reason, is to save money. So you probably want to know and think about exactly how much power you're going to generate and how much you're going to save on your utility bill as a result. And when you go through the bid process, your solar installer should provide you with an estimate of the generation from your panels and then the savings over the long term. But there are some assumptions that go into that forecast, especially when you're looking, 5, 10 years out into the future. So if you want to look into it yourself and kind of run the numbers, here's a few things that you can do. First, you can start by estimating how much power you can generate with a certain size solar installation using an online tool called PV Watts. It's free and it's pretty easy to use, and you can use that to forecast solar generation based on your specific location. It's not so specific that it's going to account for things like shading if you have trees or buildings, but it will account for, your zip code, your elevation, those sorts of things. Your installer will probably use more precise tools that do a better job accounting for site-specific things like trees or shading. But PV Watts as a starting point will give you an idea of how many kilowatts are you going to produce in a year. When it comes to savings, you need to understand how that power generation is going to translate into credits on your utility bill and how your utility will compensate you for the power that you generate and that you export to the grid. And there's two ways you save money on your bills with solar. First, during the times when you're using energy and also producing solar power. So when it's sunny out, the middle of the day, maybe you're home, the solar power goes directly to power your appliances in your home. So what you're doing is you're able to use your solar generation instead of buying power from your utility, which means you buy less power from your utility. And this is the best value you'll get from your solar because you're able to avoid purchasing energy at the retail rate. And how much you save really depends on your utility and also the rate that you've chosen or the rate that you're on from your utility. So to start, take a look at your power bill and see how much you're paying per kilowatt hour of electricity. You might be paying different amounts at different times of day or on weekends versus evenings. But understand what you're paying per kilowatt hour of energy, and that's how much you can save for every kilowatt hour that you generate yourself and you don't buy from your utility. So, for some utilities, that might be as much as 30 cents per kilowatt hour, again, depending on the time of day and the season and the day of the week. During times when you're not using energy, the power that you generate from solar will be exported to the grid, and you'll receive a credit for every kilowatt hour of power that you export to the grid, where it can go to serve other people's energy needs. And the value of that credit also varies by utility. And so it's important to look at your utility's specific policy. Right now, a credit for exporting power to the grid is just under 7 cents for APS customers, just under 6 cents for TEP customers, or about 2.8 cents for SRP customers. So pretty wide range depending on your utility. And then, you'll recall those are all a lot less than the potentially 30 cents a kilowatt hour that you're paying for energy. So it is a reduced value compared to what you can use on site to avoid purchasing energy. But that's an important consideration when you're trying to calculate how long it's going to take you to pay off that system, how much you're going to save on your monthly utility bills. And for APS and TEP customers, the price that utilities pay you for the power you export to the grid is slowly stepping down over time, but you individually get to lock in the rate that's current when you install solar for 10 years. So even if it does step down in the future, you have some certainty about what you'll be paid for the next 10 years. I think it's also important to note a new development, which is that APS recently received approval for a solar fee that equals about $2 to $3 a month, kind of on average for customers. So it isn't a large dollar amount, but that is a fee that applies when you install solar for APS customers specifically. And then last, if you're served by a different utility, like a municipal utility or a co-op that we haven't talked about, just make sure you check with the utility to see what their policy is and look at their rates specifically, because it can vary from utility to utility, and that's something you want to be really clear on before you get too far down the road. Next slide. So a question a lot of people ask is, should I add a battery to my solar? And as battery storage has gotten more available and more affordable, this is a really popular option, but it also does add cost to your system. And something that's important to know is you don't need a battery to install solar, but it does offer some benefits that you won't get without a battery. First, the battery can help you maximize the value of your solar installation. If you store energy at your home instead of exporting it to the grid when you have extra power, you can use more of your solar energy on site. And, like we've talked about, you can, rather than getting 5 or 6 cents for your energy when you export it to the grid, you can use it to avoid that much more expensive retail power from utilities. And so you can avoid having to pay higher utility prices. Second, you need a battery if you want to continue having power when the grid goes down. So if you don't have a battery, typically your system won't generate power when the grid goes down, even if the sun is shining. So if you want to have backup power during a grid outage, you need to think about what you want to be able to power with a battery. It's probably going to be prohibitively expensive to power your entire home for, multiple days with a battery. But it's going to be much more affordable to install a battery that's sized to power a few critical appliances, like maybe your fridge so that your food doesn't spoil if there's an outage, versus installing a battery big enough to run, for example, your air conditioning in the summer. So you really want to think about what are the critical things that I want to keep powered during an outage, and start with those when you're thinking about how to size your system if you are looking to be able to have that resiliency backup benefit. Next slide. I'm going to talk a little bit too about financing and some of your loan options. When it comes to paying for solar, many people choose to use a loan to finance the upfront cost of the system. And this can work out really well because if you're saving money on your utility bill and you're saving as much or more as you're paying for that loan, you can still come out ahead. And sometimes solar companies have a preferred financing partner that they work with, but you can also always go through a bank or a credit union and seek out your own financing as well if you want. When you're considering a loan, make sure you're doing an apples to apples comparison across all of the different options. There's different ways to structure loans, and so it's really important to consider not just the interest rate, but also what other fees are included. Some loans are structured with lower interest rates, and so they might look more appealing up front, but they also include other fees or financing charges that aren't obvious. And so one way to really make sure you're comparing loans on equal footing is to ask for the total cost of the loan, including all of those fees. So you can really compare, over the 10, 15, 20-year lifespan of this loan, what am I spending on fees and financing, and make sure you're comparing apples to apples. Something else to know is that some loans are structured to account for the tax credit because when you install solar, you install in 1 year, and then when you file your taxes in the following year, you can claim tax credits and get a refund on your taxes in order to, or rather get that amount returned through the tax credit. And you'll get it potentially months or even a year after you've installed solar. And so some loans are structured to account for the tax credit. So what they do is they assume that you're going to apply that tax credit whenever you get it to the balance of the loan when you receive it, which, like I said, it could be a year or more after you actually install, depending on when in the tax cycle your installation is done. Some loans, and so if your loan is structured that way, you want to make sure you understand that because they are anticipating that you're going to apply the balance of your tax credit to the loan, and it's built into the structure of it. And then last, some loans allow you to pay extra to pay off the loan early if you want to, but make sure that the loan allows you to realize the benefits of paying the loan off early by applying your balance to the principal, so that you're actually reducing the total amount of interest you owe over the lifetime of the loan, kind of similar to a car loan that you may or may not be able to pay off early. Next slide. So when it comes to tax credits, there is a federal tax credit of 30% of the total cost of the system, and the federal tax credit is non-refundable. So what that means is you have to owe at least as much in taxes as the value of the credit to claim the full amount. So if you, get a $3,000 tax credit and you owe less than $3,000 in taxes, you won't get the full amount that year in your tax credit. But what you can do is you can roll over the remaining value of the tax credit that you weren't able to use to a future year. I think right now it's important to note that the tax credit is in place and it was extended under the Biden administration. And, looking to the future, the incoming administration and majority Republican Congress have taken aim at a number of the clean energy policies that were implemented over the last few years. Nobody really knows at this point what's going to happen to these policies. I think it's reasonable to assume that tax credits are probably safer than some other programs. And I think looking, backwards, it's also worth noting that the 30% tax credit for solar has been in place since 2005, and it's been extended multiple times since then, including under the first Trump administration. So I don't have a crystal ball, unfortunately, but I'll just say that the tax credit does exist today. And so it is something that you can use for both the cost of the solar panels and for the cost of a battery. Next, there's also an Arizona state tax credit, and that is $1,000. And there are some other benefits in Arizona. For example, there's a property tax exemption and a sales tax exemption. So you don't need to pay sales taxes on your purchase. And then the property tax exemption means that the value of the solar won't add to property taxes on your home. Next slide. And then I will turn it over to Autumn to talk about warranties.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks, Adrienne. Yeah, I'll just pause here briefly to say that I'm Autumn Johnson. I'm the executive director of the Arizona Solar Energy Industries Association, or ARISEA. ARISEA is the state's solar and storage trade association, so we actually advocate for pro-renewables policies at every level of government in Arizona. We take consumer protection very seriously, and so we offer these trainings with our partners here a couple of times a year, and next year we're actually looking at expanding into a more advanced level. We call this the 101, and we're looking to introduce a 202 level next year. So if you're pretty serious about going solar but aren't doing so immediately, you might keep an eye out for that training. I will just also say, for Q&A purposes, I also happen to be an APS customer, and I have solar, and I went through the Solar United Neighbors co-op. So happy to take questions. I have a little bit of a unique perspective there. So, and actually my lender and my installer were both AirSea member companies. So happy to kind of get into the weeds there about how some of this works. It's important to keep in mind, and I saw that there was a question in the chat about companies going out of business, and we can certainly talk about that more in the Q&A. But the warranties, besides the labor warranty, the power production warranty and the parts and products warranties are going to exist regardless of which company you have. And so the solar panel manufacturing, those warranties are typically 25 years. And so those will continue to exist regardless of what happens with the company that actually installed your solar. Additional parts and products that are used besides the solar panels themselves within the installation process can vary as far as their warranties go, but typically 10 to 25 years. The only warranty that's going to be specific to the installer themselves is the labor warranty, and that's for the actual install. There are third-party insurers like Solar Insure that can actually offer warranties for workmanship and whatnot outside of the installer, but typically the labor warranties are going to be specific to whoever installs your system, and you're going to want to ask them what that warranty is, and that can vary dramatically by installer from anywhere from 5 to 30 years. So that is certainly something that you'd want to be asking them about. Next slide, please. So the next couple of slides here are really specific questions that you're going to want to consider and talk to different companies that you're getting quotes from before you make a purchase. So this is a really comprehensive list. We will send out these slides. The slides are also already available on ARISEA's website in both English and Spanish for that solar customers website that they put in the chat earlier. So these are things that you'll specifically want to be asking about. Some of these were already touched on in the course of the presentation, so I'll spend less time on them, but I do think it's worth just repeating. So you're going to want to make sure you understand, and I say this as someone who does get calls from folks who have concerns about systems that they already have, and then a lot of times they don't know this information. And so you're going to want to ask these questions and take notes on these things, but you're going to want to understand the total cost of the system to you. And so that is a slide that Kate went over, right, where it had the total cost, and then it netted out some of the tax credits and then some of the benefits from what you're saving on your electric bills. But you want to understand what the total cost is. You want to make sure that you do understand what your export rate is. That's going to depend on when you install solar and who your utility is. That's something that you're going to want to make sure that you understand and is modeled by the installer that's giving you a quote. You're going to want to understand if there are incentives that you're actually eligible for that will reduce the overall cost. So you have to be eligible for tax credits. I cannot stress that enough. Yes, there is an ITC in place. Yes, it's 30%, but again, your individual tax situation is going to make a difference as to whether or not that's actually realizable for you and will save you any money. And so that's something you're going to want to understand. If you need to take time to talk to an accountant or a CPA before you make that purchase, then that's what you should do. Some utilities will have different incentives, like SRP is not regulated by the Corporation Commission. And so if they have something for like a battery or other kind of home things that you can add, whether that's a smart thermostat or an EV charger, those are things that you're going to want to talk to the utility about. You want to have a sense of how much money you're going to save overall and what your payback period is. Are you going to recoup your investment in 8 years? Are you going to recoup it in 12 years? These are things you're going to want to know. I think a huge misconception is that people think that they're going to recoup a $30,000 or $40,000 investment in year 1, and that is just not accurate. This is a long-term investment in your home. That's the kind of mentality you need to have when you're going into it. And so you need to think about it over that kind of time horizon. And so it's important for you to have a sense of how many years will it actually take for you to break even, and then at which point will you actually be saving money. And that's going to vary significantly depending on your utility. Adrian mentioned that your installer is going to want to look at your electricity bills. They're not just going to look at your most recent bill, they're going to look at 1 year's worth of bills. And it's important to know that whatever quote you're receiving as far as how much money they anticipate you saving is going to be based on your historical usage. So one major problem is that people install solar and then they dramatically change how much electricity they use. That's going to directly impact how much money you save. If you install solar and then you use twice as much power as you did before, you're not going to save the same amount of money, right? So it's based on your current usage. It's really important to keep in mind things that might change for you over time. When I bought my solar, I had a little kid and I had a baby on the way, right? And so my usage over the past year was going to look at the usage of one person. I wanted to grow into usage for 3 people. I knew that someday I was going to have an electric vehicle, and so I wanted to make sure that I was going to grow into that system. And so as things are changing as far as your family goes, people are moving out, people are moving in, you may or may not add electric vehicle, you might have 2 electric vehicles. These are things that you're going to want to try to keep in mind because we're talking about a long-term investment. So kind of what are you looking at as far as electricity needs for the next 10 to 20 years? You're going to want to also understand electricity production that's expected from your system and whether or not there's any guarantees. And then again, we already talked a little bit about the life expectancy of the panels is 25 years, but I think it's worth just sort of touching on, depending on when you get solar, there might be technological innovations that might make a difference. And so you're going to kind of want to know sort of what the expectations are for the technology you're installing. And there is a Q&A in the chat that touches on the fact that there are different efficiencies for different kinds of panels. It's kind of like anything else. When you buy a new AC unit, they cost different amounts because they have different efficiencies, they have different production, those kinds of things. And that's the same with solar panels. And so you're going to want to ask details about that if you're getting something beyond just sort of kind of the base panel level. You're going to want to understand what Kate was touching on about what happens if there's an outage. There are questions in the chat about this too, but in Arizona, you are not allowed to island in the event of an outage from your utility unless you have storage. It's just not permissible. It's not a technological feasibility issue. It's a regulatory issue based on safety concerns. And so if you have solar on your house and there's an outage in your neighborhood, your power will also go out unless you have a battery. So that is something that you want to make sure that you understand. And then whether or not adding that storage, some of this is your own sort of cost benefit analysis as to what it's worth to you and what you want to pay for it, right? If you want whole home backup because it's something you're really concerned about, there is a cost there. And so you're just sort of balancing that relative to the payback period and also the other benefits that you want to receive from your system besides just a bill reduction. So I don't actually remember how this came to be in red, but it is red. So I'm assuming at some point we decided this was really important. But I think when you use power is something that's really important. So it's not just the quantity of the power that you use, it's when you use your electricity. If you're someone who's on a time of use plan, if you want to make sure that even with your solar, that you're paying attention to that as far as when you're using electricity. If you have solar on your home and you do not have a battery, you want to be doing your laundry or running your dishwasher or your pool pump or whatever during the day when your solar is producing, and not at night when you're buying it from the grid, because you're buying it from the grid at a higher rate than APS is paying you, or TEP or whomever is paying you for the electricity that you're selling them back to the grid. And so it's more financially advantageous to use that excess solar during the day than it is to sell it back to the grid. And so you have to kind of shift some of your behavior based on that. I think we can move on to the next slide. Okay. We didn't talk too much about the difference between loans and leases. When Kate was talking about that, there is a difference. And so if you have a loan, that is like your mortgage, right? You own your house, but you're paying your bank over time for your residence. That is the same kind of thing with a loan for solar panels. You own the panels, they're on your house, you're benefiting from the system, and you're paying a financial institution back for them. If you have a lease, it means someone else owns the panels, like if you lease a car, and then you're paying essentially to use that over time, and in exchange for that payment, you get the bill offset. And so things like how long you plan to live in your house, what interest rates are at the time, whether or not you can put any money down, and other kinds of things like that will impact whether or not a loan or a lease is more advantageous to you. You want to make sure that you understand when your payments start relative to when the system might go online. One of the biggest complaints that I hear from people is that their system's not online yet, but they already had to start paying for it. So they're paying their electric bill and they're paying for their solar system. For me, that wasn't the case. I have a loan through a credit union, and I didn't start paying until after I had actually certified to the financial institution that yes, the system is online, yes, it's working. And so those kind of practices are going to vary. And something that Kate touched on, I think, is really important. You might want to spend as much time vetting your lender as you do vetting your installer. Okay, you do not have to go with the lender that's just the default for the solar company, when you're kind of going through and checking the boxes. When I bought my new AC unit a couple of years ago, I just went with whatever was the lender that they recommended that told me that they had a 0% interest rate. And I came to learn later when I was buying my solar that a 0% interest rate doesn't mean that there's not a financing fee. It's hidden in the actual cost of the loan, and so it's hard to compare apples to apples, but you're not paying nothing for financing the system over 3 years. You're paying something, it's just not in the interest rate. It's baked into the underlying total cost of the system. And so you might want to spend time asking questions of the installer and even independently calling around to different financial institutions. I myself, when I bought solar, probably called a half a different financial institutions to ask about different options, what their interest rates were, whether or not I could pay it back early, what the financing fees were, and those kinds of things. And so those are the kinds of terms that you're going to, and I picked my lender separate from what the installer was doing. And so I made a choice about the installer, I made a choice about the lender, and you can do that as well. And I would recommend having that much due diligence on the front end, because the difference in financial institutions, because once the install is done, the financial institution is who you're going to continue to work with, assuming that it's a loan, or so you will continue to talk to them and maybe not your installer. And so you want to make sure that they have good customer service, and you want to make sure that it's not costing you more than it should to go with that institution. Something else you're going to want to be needing to understand is whether or not you have to upgrade anything else. So when I got my solar installed, I had an independent roofing inspection. I had a roofer come out, and the solar installer does a roofing inspection. And you can do that as well to make sure that you get a recommendation as to the quality of your roof before the panels are installed. I had to get an upgrade of my electric panel. That's something that you may or may not have to do, and it's an added cost, and it also will take longer for your install. It's important to know that if you do get a panel upgrade, they are going to shut off your power for up to an entire day. day. And so if your install is in the summer and you're going to have no AC for the whole day, that might make a difference to you as to when you're installing solar. It made a difference to me. You also might have to have other kinds of changes. So things like where your fence is relative to your panel and shutoff switches, whether or not that has to go under a sidewalk or some kind of concrete, can all affect the different kinds of things that you have to do in the install process and how much that'll cost to you. And so those are questions that you should ask on the front end. We talked already a little bit about warranties, but you're going to want to make sure you ask about them, specifically the labor warranties, and you're going to want to ask about transferability. Kate already, I think it was Kate or Adrian already touched on maintenance. You're not really going to need maintenance necessarily for the panels, but you might want to talk about things like, what if you need roof maintenance and your panels are already installed, or inverters or something that do tend to go out that people talk a lot about. And so those are things that you might want to ask questions about. Is the performance of the system monitored by anyone? And if so, by whom? If it's a lease, that might be the case. If it's a loan, it may not be. A lot of people are really surprised that their system goes offline and no one tells them. The utility does not tell them. The installer does not tell them. That's why it's really important that you download and utilize the application that is associated with your system and you monitor it yourself online. I check the production of my panels every couple of days, just to make sure that everything's working fine and as I expect. And you also can actually see your usage relative to your solar production, and that will give you a really good indication of how it's going to be impacting your bills. If all your power usage is outside of the bell curve for your solar, you're not maximizing your bill savings. You really want to be concentrating that power usage and see your spikes when your solar is producing. These are questions here about the sales company relative to the install. So I think a lot of people are surprised that if someone knocks on your door to sell you solar, they may not be the company that's actually installing solar. So like with a lot of industries, sales can be outsourced to different companies where their primary function is just to sell something, and then someone else is going to come and install it. That is unusual in some industries and more common in other industries. It's pretty common with solar, and so you will want to ask about that. You might want to, and you don't have to buy solar from someone that comes to your door. If you know you want to get solar or you're interested in solar, you can take time to think about it and get multiple bids and have Solar United neighbors review them, and that kind of thing, and do your homework online. I always tell people that if you would not buy something on Amazon with 1 star, you should not buy a major home purchase from an installer that has 1 star, and you should look up people's ratings, right? You need to look up what their reviews are. You need to look up what their BBB rating is. You need to look up if they have complaints with the Register of Contractors. These are things that you should do as a good as due diligence, just as a good purchaser of something. And we're talking about what is a significant investment in your home. When you're making a significant investment, you should do homework before you do that. And then these are questions just to ask about, who is the point of contact if something goes wrong, who would be doing maintenance and those kinds of things. And there's a question in the chat about this, so I'll just maybe address it here. Companies do go out of business. It happens. My own solar installer went out of business. Arisea does maintain a list of resources where there are companies that have already agreed that they will service installations of other companies. And so we maintain that on our solar customers website. You can go there if your company were to go out of business, and you can make sure that someone else will be willing to come out and do any kind of maintenance. If you have a lease, it's a different situation. If you have a lease and your company goes out of business, just like with your mortgage, that will be bundled and sold to another company, and they will take over the lease at the same terms. So if you have a lease, like let's say with SunPower, and they were to go out of business, someone else will assume that lease and they will take over maintenance. And so you just have to have a little bit of patience kind of in that transition. Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, so here we're talking about, I think that these resources are important on the front end and on the back end. So what the whole point of this training is so that you have an excellent experience installing solar. I love my solar. I wish I'd gone solar years before. I have little to no utility bills, and the money that I do spend is going to a solar company, that is creating jobs in the local economy, and they're reducing carbon emissions, and not to my monopoly utility. And to me, that makes a really big difference. And so we want you to love your solar, and so we want you to have all the information you need going in on the front end to make a good decision. If for some reason something should go wrong, despite our best efforts, these are the resources with which you would use to pursue a remedy. So you can file a complaint with the Better Business Bureau. That's usually where I recommend people to start, because they'll actually go back and forth and try to negotiate with the business to resolve what the problem is. You also can do reviews on the Better Business Bureau. The Register of Contractors is where you would go if there is a technical problem, an installation problem, something that has to do with the actual functioning, the mechanical functioning of the system. And they will actually can come out and do an inspection and assess what's going on. And all installers have to be licensed with the Register of Contractors. And so there are like very specific penalties to them. The Attorney General's office is where you would go if you had some kind of fraudulent issue, some kind of like sales practice that is improper, something along those lines, a problem with the financial institution. All of that would go through the Attorney General's office, which is doing consumer protection. And so we have in the slides, these are links actually to the specific complaints arm of those agencies, and ARISEA also has all of those on our solar customers website. Next page, please. So this is just a fraction of the resources that are available. ARISEA's resources page has links to these, as well as a number of the other resources we talked about. Something that hasn't been mentioned yet is Solar United Neighbors actually has a hotline where you can actually talk to them about all of your solar questions, in addition to them reviewing your proposals. And so those are free resources that are impartial. They do not represent a company. They are not for profit. And so I highly, highly recommend people utilize those. ARISEA's website has links to all of these, as well as the recording of this training, as well as the slides in English and Spanish. And so we are here for you and want to make sure that you have a good experience. Next slide, please. This is also, I just wanted to touch on, I'm not sure what the ground mounted solar link is, but the APS and SRP do have preferred installers programs. And so if those are one of your two utilities, that is another place to go and see additionally kind of quality assured installers. Those installers go through a training process. They have to have their materials reviewed. They have to have certain point of contact as far as customer service goes. They have to have been in business for a certain amount of time. And so it is just an additional place to make sure that what you are, who you're going with, has some additional assurances. I don't know. Does anybody else know what the ground mounted solar link is? And we don't know what that is. That is not I don't think that's a customer protection issue. That might just be a clarity issue as far as how it works. If you wanted to put that on the ground as opposed to your roof. And then this is the contact information of the people that are specifically presenting this training. And so I will pause there and turn it back over to Adrian.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Autumn and Kate. That was awesome. So looking at through the Q&A questions, and I think we'll start going through those here to answer some of these questions out loud. I know some of them we just answered, Autumn. Let's see. So I purchased solar in 2012 due to bankruptcies. The inverter has died for the second time now in 2023. Solar is still not running a year or more later. How do I avoid this problem? Because solar companies come and go.
So I'd recommend that you go to ARISEA's website, which is that solar customers website. And we have a link at the top and the bottom that's like what to do if your solar installer goes out of business. And then it's a list of companies that are ready and able and have agreed to help customers that their installer went out of business. And it actually will have, in the notes section, we'll have like if they only work in certain parts of the state or if they offer some services and not others. But that's where I would specifically go to make sure that you can find an installer that has signed a code of ethics and specifically has agreed to work on the systems installed by someone else.
Yeah, and Jewel, if you need any help with that, feel free to reach out to Sun, and we'd be happy to point you in the right direction. This one I think we kind of answered also. Can we go off grid living in the city? Generally, no. I don't know if there's any cities in Arizona where if you're in city limits, you can go off grid. Normally, that's like a permitting requirement that you have to be connected to the larger electricity system. There are some places like in rural counties where I know you can go off grid, but generally not in the city.
It's also, I just think it's worth pointing out too that there is a cost issue here. So Arizona does have member companies that do off-grid solar, but that is a very different financial situation and is typically not something that is going to be financed like a typical solar system. And so, you know, if you're someone that has a lot of cash lying around for something along that, then there are companies on our member list on our website. If you go to aircia.org under the About tab, there are our member companies, and there are companies that specifically are off-grid.
Another question here, can utility sign-off be avoided? Generally, no. If your system is being attached to the larger electricity system, they have to issue permission to operate, PTO. I suppose if you are an off-grid system, then you wouldn't. Is that correct, Autumn?
If you're off-grid, there's no interconnection and there's no utility role. So the utility is only involved to the extent that your system is interconnecting to the grid. But if your system is interconnected to the grid, there's absolutely no way to avoid utility sign-off. You will have to get an inspection from both your city or county, depending on where you live, called an AHJ or authority having jurisdiction, and your utility, and they will both inspect.
And this one's specific to you, Autumn. Did you see the APS monthly solar fee of about $2 to $5 on your bill, or was it higher than that?
So I think it's worth just pointing out here that you won't necessarily see it on your bill. So if you, depending on when you installed solar, that will make a difference as to whether or not you actually see it as a line item. If you are someone, if you're on this call, I think someone mentioned that they installed solar in 2012. If you're on this call and you are a net metered customer or you're on a legacy solar plan for APS, it's embedded, you are paying the additional fee, but it's embedded in your base rates. And so you're not going to see that as a line item charge. You're only going to see a line item charge if you're on a rate plan that is TOU E, R2 or R3. That's going to be anybody basically that installs solar after what, Kate, 2018, 2019-ish timeframe. And so if you've installed solar in the last 5 or 6 years, you're going to see something that's specifically on your bill called a grid access charge. The amount of the charge is dependent on the size of your system, not the production of your system, but the actual kilowatts, not kilowatt hours of your system. And it depends on the rate plan. So it's around a quarter-ish per kilowatt. That could very much change. There is no cap on that. And so when that was instituted by the Arizona Corporation Commission, they did not set a ceiling. And so ARC is currently working, and Vote Solar is currently working to fight that charge as a discriminatory charge that is not just and reasonable. But it is currently on the bills, and we don't know how it would or wouldn't change in the future. But you would see it as a line item depending on when you installed your solar.
Jewel, to your point about the Attorney General's office, I hear you. I will say, like, I think we're very fortunate in Arizona where we do have a pretty good ally in the Attorney General's office. There's been a number of recent events that she has done to come after, like, very inappropriate solar companies who have been doing some scammy stuff. She's also, like, participated in multiple hearings in defense of solar customers. So I will say that she has been a good advocate, but if you're experiencing an issue right now, you need a resolution quickly, I'd really encourage you to reach out to our help desk. You can schedule a 15-minute appointment, go through the specifics of your problem, and we'll be able to hopefully get you a resolution much more quickly, if that's what you're after.
Yeah, if I'll just add to that, I mean, as someone who has been on both sides, like as far as, you know, trying to work with the Attorney General's office on consumer protection stuff, and actually as a customer who has not for a solar company, but has filed complaints with the Attorney General's office on other sales stuff. I mean, it is, you know, I don't like specifically understand how they determine which ones to work on and which ones not to. I do think it's really important to file a complaint if you're a consumer that has a fraud concern, because I do think that there is some amount of, if it's a numbers issue and they're getting a lot of complaints about a specific company, then they're more likely to address it. They will do some back and forth with the company, even if they don't reach the resolution that you want. And so I there are companies with which even just getting a call or a letter from the Attorney General's office is enough to actually get them to just do the right thing and resolve the situation. And so I don't think you should just entirely abandon the AG complaint process, even if you haven't necessarily had an experience that reached your satisfaction. But it is, just a tool in the toolbox. It's not, necessarily going to pan out the way that you want, but I think it is an important resource for people.
Let's see. A question here from Mary about, can you stage the install so that you put a battery storage on later? The answer to that is yes. You can just install solar now and add a battery later. If you're planning on doing so, it's probably a good idea to let your installer know. There may be some design considerations just to make it easier to add a battery later, but yeah, usually that's pretty easy to do. And then how about increasing the number of panels later? Yes, this is something you can also do, but it will impact the rate that you're locked into. So you can only increase capacity by a certain amount. Otherwise, that will basically remove your grandfathering status and the utility will consider it as a new system. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think for APS, that's 1 kilowatt or 10%. I'm not sure what the others are. So you need to be really careful about adding additional panels because that could reset the rate plan that you're on.
Yeah, and just two things. So if you do want to add a battery later, it is really important that you tell your installer because the inverter will make a difference. And so not all inverters are going to have that capability. Same thing with an EV charger or something along those lines. You are going to need a different inverter if you are going to want to do that. So like when I install my solar, I did not choose to add a battery at that time, but I probably will later. But I did add an EV charger, even though I don't yet have an EV. And so those are things that you'll want to take into consideration at the outset. I really do not recommend adding panels later because you do get into a really tricky situation as far as your export rate and locking that rate in for 10 years. If you're already out of, if you've had solar for 10 years, and you need to add more later, then you're out of your locked in rate anyway. And so maybe that doesn't matter. But what Adrian said is right. You can only add a really small amount that is measured in AC, not DC. And so that is really important to know. It might be different depending on your utility. If you're SRP, for instance, that may not at all make a difference because you're only getting paid like, less than 3 cents for your export rate. So, and it's not, there wasn't a locked in kind of grandfathering thing. So it depends a little bit on your utility, but generally, try to plan ahead. Your installer should be able to model some different scenarios and different usage in the future if you're anticipating that.
And then Eric, I wanted to make sure we answered all your questions. I do not seem to have the ability to unmute people, but go ahead, Eric. Looks like Trinity got it.
Okay, are you hearing me?
Yeah, what's your question?
Okay. I had just been asked about the question, and as far as the one where I was talking about the industry pushing the efficiency of their panels and that kind of thing. And the comment I got back was that we don't understand the question. And I thought it was pretty simple. The way that the industry, I'll put this out for everybody, measures the panel efficiency is by the amount of power in watts that you get effectively for a given amount of panel area. And people are going to want to sell you a panel that is of the most efficient in terms of power output per panel area. And it turns out in the looking that I have done that what seems to really be important, unless you have a specific area unless you have a very specific need to pack as much power generation into as small an area as possible, that may be a better, I'm just asking, wouldn't it be a better metric to maximize generation per dollar than to maximize it per unit area, as seems to be pushed by the industry pushing panel efficiency? It's economic efficiency that seems to be important, and a lot of people seem to miss that. So what's your take on that?
Kate, did you want to address that at all, or I'm happy to give my.
Sure. Yeah, I'll just say, yeah, Eric, I think you're right. Some people are in a situation where, maybe they have a very small roof or a very small portion of their roof that's usable for solar panels and larger energy usage. So they do need, and panels are typically rated in watts, right? So I imagine kind of like cutting edge, the most efficient panel on the market might be like a 4, or even I saw maybe 500-watt panel. Whereas, last year's panel maybe is a 300 or a 350-watt panel. And so if you have limited roof space and you're trying to pack as much power generation as you can into your roof space, you might want to go with that panel, even if it's a little more expensive.
Basically.
Exactly. Yeah. And if you have a big roof and you have plenty of space and you don't need to, you could probably save some money by going with a less efficient panel that's still going to provide all the power generation that you need.
Well, what I have been looking at is people go, oh, the most efficient panel possible, pack the most energy generation into the area that you have. But if you look at it on a dollar per watt basis, as it might actually be a more cost effective to use less efficient panels actually, and get a higher dollar per watt out of those less efficient panels. It covers more area, but what I would hope people would be concerned about is the amount of generation or the amount of power they can get out of their system, as opposed to oh, I have the most efficient thing up there. The question being whether it's efficient in terms of money or whether it's efficient in terms of area required to operate. And I have noticed a lot of the industry will push the efficiency per unit area, and well, maybe that's where the money is for the industry, but a lot of people don't know to look at efficiency in terms of economic efficiency.
I think that this is a total customer by customer decision, because it also depends on which direction.
It is.
It depends on which direction your roof faces. Like for instance, my house is north to south, which is like great generally, but if I want to be able to go, we're going to need to have, it's going to be more economic to have more production later in the day as the TOU hours for your utility go later and later. So you're really going to want to have some west facing panels. I have a tiny little garage that has like this much space for west facing panels. And so the efficiency of the panels makes a big difference. And so I don't think that there's a blanket approach here. It's really going to depend on the size of the home, the direction the roof faces, and the usage, and then the utility. So what rate plan you're on is going to make a difference. If you're on a flat rate versus a TOU, I have never had any customers complain to me about this issue before. One thing I will say is people are very hung up on the quantity of panels that they have, and that is essentially irrelevant for almost all purposes. And so people will call me all the time and say, I have 40 panels. And I'm like, that doesn't actually matter, like from a system, from overall functioning, because like you said, the efficiency of the panels are different, and what direction they face makes a big difference, and all of this kind of stuff.
I don't want to know how many panels. If you're getting into a pecker contest, I want to know how many watts you're generating.
Right. But so, I mean, for our purposes, I think that's just an individual decision.
Yeah, but I just figured I'd bring that up because I think it's a good point for customer education for the people who were trying to educate to know to look at both of those and balance it for their particular use case.
Absolutely. Thanks, Eric. All right. Any other questions?
I think Jewel has another question.
See, I believe this was all solar because it was listed entirely under the solar block. The electricity was separate and the normal. Oh, I think she's talking about the grid access. This is in reference to the grid access.
Yeah, and the specific bill increase. In response to Jules' previous question, I mentioned that there was a general rate increase that applied to everybody who is an APS customer at the same time the solar fee was implemented. And so it can be, you know, if you're just looking at your total monthly energy bill, it can be hard to tease out what was part of the regular rate increase and what was the solar specific one. But Jewel, if you saw an increase of $30 grid access charge, the grid access charge is clearly defined as a charge that's about 20 to 25 cents per kilowatt.
She doesn't have the
solar,
grid access charge because she installed solar in 2012. So for Jewel, you're like not a grid access charge customer. That would not be applicable to you. You're paying an additional rate simply because you have solar, but it's hidden in your bill. APS tells me it's not hidden, but it very much is. So you paid 15% greater increase than everyone else's increase. So you paid the increase that all residential customers for APS had, plus 15% on top of that, but it's not going to be itemized or delineated, and they don't break it out for you. I wish we had a more satisfying answer. We're literally in litigation with APS right now over this issue. So we agree with you, and I'm doing my darndest to reverse it.
Alrighty, we're coming up past the hour. So I think we'll probably leave it there for now. All of our information, our contact information is in the chat. So if you have any other questions, please feel free to email us. Like we said, this will be recorded this recording will be sent to everybody who RSVP'd if you need to review it again. But otherwise, thank you so much for joining us. I hope you learned something new, and please reach out if you need our help. Thanks, Autumn and Kate.